Welcome to Wayward Writers. I'm Heather Cashman.
I'm Stephanie Bearce.
And I'm Nicki Jacobsmeyer.
Thank you so much for joining us today. We're excited to have an amazing author with us, Vicki Erwin, and she is brilliant, and anyone who has talked to her knows this.
Yes.
Stephanie, will you tell us a bit more about Vicki?
I would be happy to, because Vicki is one of my critique partners and she is brilliant. But besides being a critique partner with me, she is a veteran of the book business. She's worked in a variety of positions in public libraries, independent bookstores. She's been a book buyer and she's owned a bookstore too. She's been a sales rep and she just has a wealth of knowledge. But in addition to all those hats that she's worn, she has written many books and 31 of them have been published. Genres that she's written in include middle grade and YA mystery, picture book, activity books, adult regional history, and true crime. She has an MFA in writing popular fiction from Seton Hill University. She lives in St. Louis with her husband, Jim, who is her sometimes co-author, and their dog, Luna, who is the boss. The dog boss, but also the boss. Welcome, Vicki. We're so excited to have you here today. And that's just a little bit about your history. Could you tell us about the journey that brought you into the writing world?
I can. Thank you. And thank you so much for having me.
I'm so happy to have you.
When I was out of college and had two babies that were under 3, I was at home all the time, and my husband said, "You've always wanted to write. Why don't you do it now?" And he had no idea that I couldn't even go to the bank without changing like 4 diapers on the way before I got out of the house. But he was very good and made sure I had some free time to write when I needed to. That resulted, after several, or maybe I should even say many tries, in my first book that was published, Jamie and the Mystery Quilt. And then I just went on from there.
That's amazing. I love when you started to say I couldn't go to the and you said bank, I thought you were going to say go to the bathroom by yourself, because I don't know anyone else out there. When mine were littles, like that was just not a personal activity. So I get it. Like writing is not, when people are like, oh, you're home all day with your kids. I think some of us can attest that it's not as easy as it might sound at times.
That's completely true. And I didn't get to go to the bathroom by myself either, but
no. and now it's probably Luna, if you're like my house. Now it's my dog, so that they want to be part of that. Okay, so that's a crime in itself. Speaking of crime. Okay, true crime. First of all, I have to tell you, this past weekend I got home from a trip and I sat in one sitting and devoured Slaying of South St. Louis. Loved it.
Good.
It was so good. I was totally captivated. I'm a true crime junkie. I love reading and the podcast and everything. So my question is, what got you interested to writing true crime?
I actually took a class. And because I was writing mysteries, and I thought if I took this class in true crime that it would give me some insight into also writing mysteries. So I took a true crime writing class at Fontbonne College. With a woman named Ellen Harris, who is from St. Louis, and she had written a couple of books. Now, this was a pretty long time ago. It was probably in the early 90s that I did this. And even though I went to get more insight into writing mysteries, I really got bitten by the true crime bug. And St. Louis, unfortunately, is a place that you can kind of find true crime to write about.
We have some interesting criminal episodes.
Yeah. That's absolutely true. And I particularly like unsolved true crime. And at the time, one of the ones that really had me fascinated, because I had children about the same age, was a little girl up in North St. Louis that had been abducted. They found her murdered. And
Mhm.
at that time, they did not have any idea who did it. Now, I had spoken at her school and knew her teacher. That was another connection that I had. Anyways, that was where I first became interested in it, was as a result of that class.
Okay. Yeah, that's so interesting. And you already shared a little bit about your personal connections. And I know we've had side conversations about growing up in Mexico and living in Kirkwood. So can you share on that? Because I know, I'm sure you guys too, when I go and hear mystery or thriller authors speak, often when people say, what inspired you? It's based on a true crime. Fact is stranger than fiction, right? So a lot of that's rooted in real things. So what are some of your other personal connections with some of the books you've written?
The first true crime book I wrote, the one you were talking about, that was my brother-in-law's mother that was murdered. And when my sister and brother-in-law were getting ready to get married, I said, "What about Dave's mom?" And she said, "Oh," and then she told me this whole story. And I said, "What happened? Did they ever find the guy?" They found him right away, but Nikki, as
Yeah.
from reading the book, there was a lot of other things that happened along the way. And Dave and his sister Laura and his father was alive at the time, Don, they were all very concerned about the fact that they didn't feel like they had gotten justice for their mother or their wife.
Mhm.
And at some point, Dave got the court transcripts, and then he started to suggest to me, at first very just a little
Hints?
hint,
Yeah.
and then more and more.
It was more blatant. Write this book.
Yeah. He finally said, "Would you write this book?"
Mhm.
And I actually wrote that one with my son, Brian.
Mhm. Was
So,
that had to have been a huge, that's a big ask. Like, what were your feelings? Because it's obviously a true story that he's
well, I
asking
was
what an
very
Related
author.
to
I was very interested in the case,
Sure.
first of all. And yeah, it was a big ask, but it was my chance to finally have an in to a true crime book that I had access and a connection
Yeah.
to. So that was the big thing. So it was a big and as a result of that book, you probably don't need to know this, but I'm going to tell you anyway. Dave has a website called the Love Sisters. His
Oh.
mother's maiden name was Love, and it's called the Love Sisters, and it's a project that helps children who have had a violent death in their family.
Oh.
Oh, that's awesome. Thanks
Yeah,
for
it
sharing
is.
that. What is
Yes.
the website? Can you tell us?
I,
Or give it to us
I-
and we'll put it in the show notes too.
Yeah.
'Cause
okay,
Sure.
that's
all right.
awesome.
I think it's lovesisters.com, but I'm not
Okay.
absolutely sure.
That's great. What a wonderful project and something good to come out of such a tragedy too.
Because this was so personal to you, do you have any advice about how to handle these true crime stories with sensitivity? Because it feels like those people are already victims, and then what if their story doesn't want to become part of a book? Or what if there are some people who want it, but some people who don't? And how are you sensitive to the emotions of all the parties involved with this kind of writing about true crime?
Since my first foray was fairly easily, although I do have to say Dave's dad was a little bit hesitant, and he still, and even to me and even to his children, will not talk about certain aspects of that crime.
Mhm.
We sat at our dining room table when I interviewed him and cried. It's very hard. And I have to say, it's probably the one reservation I have about writing about true crime
Mhm.
is intruding upon the victims' families. I really do have that reservation, and I try to choose carefully. I think that's one reason I like historical crimes.
Yes.
And secondly, it's hard. It's just
Mhm.
very hard. And it's very hard when you do have a personal connection, I have to
Oh,
say.
yeah.
I would agree to that. I have a personal connection in my family with a true crime. And I've also often thought about maybe one day writing about it. And the thing is, when you experience it and have that connection, the entertainment value of it completely disappears. And I enjoyed true crime before. And then when this happened, it was like, whoa. And now I've been able to enjoy it in that way, in the perspective of, I think people, at least what is intriguing is to learn from it. The whole knowledge is power. And how can I protect myself and share this with my loved ones so it doesn't happen? Or what can I be looking out to maybe help someone solve an unsolved mystery? But I know there is this conversation about, like you saying, like someone else's star. And I think just reading your book and Notorious Missouri, like I just felt like you and the men in your life that you co-authored with, you guys were very compassionate, and
Thank you.
you don't see
Thank you.
that always when you read true crime. At least I haven't. So I think you guys used very delicate hands, but I can see where you're saying like historical, just like anything, we can take a step back. Those people
Right.
aren't alive anymore, or it might be generations, not immediate. What are your thoughts on that as far as true crime as a genre of reading and watching?
Number one, I did not want to make the criminal the main character in it. And I completely agree with you that one of the reasons that people are so fascinated by true crime is I think they think if I learn everything I can learn about it, then it won't happen to me. And I have a very good friend that writes true crime, and hers is all historical true crime, and she has several podcasts about it. Wicked Words, Kate Winkler Dawson. And that's what she always says is, it's people want to know so they can protect themselves more than anything else. Like I said, I try to approach it more from the victim. And also, I know a big trend these days is for the author to make themselves a character in the book. Because there's all this movement towards citizen detectives or internet detectives or whatever name you choose to call it. To me, that's a little more intrusive than writing about the characters involved themselves as opposed to making yourself a character in the book. No, but that is my one reservation, and I haven't looked avidly for a new topic to write about since the Notorious Crimes because of that, for that very same reason. So I don't know. I love it. And I listen to podcasts and I read the books, and I just read a bunch of the Golden State Killer things and I really enjoyed it. And I didn't enjoy it. I don't know. I was fascinated by it. There's words that you use in talking about these genres that then you look back at yourself and you go, that's not what I meant. That is not what I meant.
The psychology is fascinating.
It's fascinating.
It is.
I also I really, though, the idea of giving that voice to the victim.
Yeah.
And I think that's really an important way that an author can not necessarily solve the crime or add anything that way, but giving that voice to the victim and allowing their story to be heard from that perspective. And I really like that from your A Slaying in St. Louis. I think you guys did a really good job of telling her story and the story of her family. And the story of how it affected laws.
Yes.
And I thought that was very important to show what change came about because of that. And maybe you could talk a little bit about that change.
Oh, if you want me to, yeah. Okay, the perpetrator in that particular case was a 15-year-old boy. And they found him, and he confessed within 24 hours. And they found the weapon. They had all kinds of evidence. They had his confession. They had all of that. But there was a controversy about whether he had been properly represented. At that time, there was a specially trained officers within the police department that would deal with juveniles. And then there was also the separate juvenile office, which still exists. It's not really a dual system, but it sounds like a dual system. He had the specially trained police officer in the interview with him, but they did not have a juvenile officer. And that was one of the main reasons that after 3 trials, he still was never convicted of this crime.
Whoa.
Yeah, I was really glad it was just my dogs with me when I was reading it and my family was gone, because I was up and I was like, wait, what are you talking about? Because the law, right? So everything. Yeah. And I understand we have a law system for a reason, but because of those things, right? Anything that was said was like gone. It never happened. And it's interesting after sitting in trials, criminal trials, murder trials, that there's a business to presenting the facts. And it's okay. It's not like publishing and all, but I'm saying like, I'm like there are things that happen in publishing that sometimes we just don't understand. It's that's not fair. That doesn't make sense or whatever. It doesn't. And it's like this case and many others.
He lucked out in so many ways.
Oh.
I was given a whole new opportunity to have a life, a useful life for the rest. And he didn't take that opportunity.
And that's it, Vicki.
That's
He
so, that's
squandered
heartbreaking.
it every time.
Every single time.
Sorry, not to give the book away. Go buy the book. You're going to love it.
It is very good.
It is.
Okay, so when you, obviously these books are really research intensive because you not only have to set up like the world building and the characters, but then you have all this like minutia of facts and what happened and timelines and all of that. So can you describe your process of researching, interviewing, writing when you write true crime with us?
It of course differs according to the case. Of course, with the slaying book, I started by talking to Dave and Laura, the siblings, children of the victim. And then we had the court documents, and so we read those. I had access, and Brian had access. Brian dug up, and I'm not even sure, but I'm sure it had to do with the internet, dug up a police officer that he talked to that had been a police officer during the time that the perpetrator was committing all of his crimes. Not just murder, but he did a lot of other things too.
Yeah.
And I had access. One of my husband's law partners just happened to be an assistant. Okay, they call it an assistant prosecutor in the city at the time. That's not what they call it in our city. They call it a circuit attorney, but that's what he was. And so he came and we had coffee one morning and we talked about it. So it really rounds things out a little bit if you can talk to people that are involved. Newspapers, I think, if I only had to choose one way to research these things, I would go to the newspaper, especially the old ones. Have some descriptions that you would not believe and which you would never find in a newspaper today that say things that like, really? You wrote that in your newspaper article? But
they're so graphic or why?
They're graphic, but they also give their own opinions, or they'll make a quality kind of judgment on something that's going on. And it's just really interesting to read how journalism has changed through time as well. So newspapers, and if there's a book about the crime, of course, I would read any book that there was that had anything to do with the crime. For example, one of the crimes in Notorious, Missouri, the granddaughter had written a book about it. And I also talked to her. Like I said, if you can talk to somebody, again, if you're doing historical crimes, sometimes it's really hard to find somebody that has a connection to it. But if you can, that makes a big difference. And then I get all that together. I'm looking for the story is what I'm doing,
Right.
you know, and then tell it like a story.
You're talking a little bit about your resources, and you said newspapers. Those are getting fewer and farther between now. So what other resources would you be able to look stuff up in? And
I guess you can go to the internet, or sometimes there's, for example, with the slaying in South St. Louis, there were journal articles. There was a law journal article about it. Sometimes in the Missouri Historical Review, or because I'm working in Missouri, that's the reason. But sometimes in other journals, there's an article about a historic crime that's occurred. So there's that. Of course, I Google every name that's involved in the thing to see if I can find out anything else. And sometimes you do, but a lot of times these are normal everyday people. And with historic crimes, of course, there was no internet to Google. There was nothing at the time that you would be on the internet unless somebody's written it later.
Speaking of talking about resources, also, what about resources that helped you decide how to structure your story? Are there any crime writing books? You said you took a class. What other things could you point authors to who might want to dive into the true crime genre?
I have to say, I never read a book about how to write true crime. I took that class, and Ellen was a wonderful teacher. Just to tell you how that was set up, because it was so fascinating, was she had a guest speaker from every angle of a crime, from,
Oh, wow. I love it.
investigation, the legal angles on both sides, the defense attorney and the prosecuting attorney, just every person that you could. Of course, you can't have a murder victim come in and talk to you, but
Probably not.
she had a woman who had been the victim of an attempted murder come in and
Oh,
talk
wow.
to us. And that was also very interesting in how that all unfolded. Heather mentioned timeline a minute ago. A timeline
Mhm.
is also very invaluable because
Mhm.
things can get very tangled up time wise. And so if you write it down, I think with almost any history that's true, but that's one of the things that was
Mhm.
very helpful.
So do you have one
Well,
of those walls where you're like putting push pins and drawing yarn things like
No,
stringing
I have
them?
notebooks. If I could
No
show you
murder
my
board.
if I could show you my desk, I can't even ask Stephanie.
There's a few.
I love notebooks, and I put them all in notebooks and make copious notes.
so do you have a favorite? Are you like in the summer, are you the back to school Vicki getting all the spiral
Whenever
notebooks? Or
whenever my grandchildren need a notebook for school, they know to call me.
that's
We downsized, which some of we
yeah.
downsized recently, and we gave 4 of those big plastic storage containers full of office supplies to Booksmart, which is a place that teachers can come and not buy. They actually pretty much get to be given for free
Oh,
school supplies. And there just wasn't room for them in this new house. So, although I've managed to
I was going
refill.
to say, you haven't stopped collecting them,
No,
though.
I have not. I have not. It's a very pathetic
no, it's
No,
hobby.
it's
not.
not.
It's great. It's working for you. Look at you. It's working.
It's what writers do:
Yep,
pens and
Oh,
notebooks.
well,
absolutely.
I could go there too, but I won't.
Okay, so can we talk a little about the craft of it? So how, once you got all your research done, how did you incorporate like the suspenseful narrative while still keeping it nonfiction and true?
First of all, in many ways, it's a mystery. So you use mystery writing techniques to write it that way. You
Mhm.
don't immediately say this is, of course, if you've read the jacket copy, you would know, but you don't immediately say this is who did it and this is how
Mhm.
you I are the way I do it. This is the way I do it. I do it in a time by time. I
Chronological?
start at
Okay.
the beginning and then I end at the ending of whatever
Mhm.
happened. So that's what I do. And like I said, I try to find the story. The story in the slaying in South St. Louis was this whole lack of justice, number one, and number two, the change and the fact that he had all of these chances at the same time. And I do not feel like I succeeded as well as I had hoped to in this. I had hoped to say one of the things is that they never talked about this in their family. They never discussed it. And that was one of the things that bothered the kids, bothered
Mhm.
Dave and Laura. And what were they doing when at these different points in the process? And the hard thing about that was sometimes Dave and Laura didn't know what was going on. So
Mhm.
they couldn't
Sure.
say exactly what was happening.
Yeah.
The one they did remember was there was a retrial and they were planning to go on vacation and they had to cancel their vacation because their dad had to testify.
Mhm. And remind me how old they were when this
When it
happened.
happened, Laura was 5 and Dave was 3.5.
Oh
Mm.
gosh.
And they
I
went,
know it went on forever.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. And
but
they went in his final trial where he was finally convicted, not of Nancy's
right.
murder, but when he was finally convicted of a murder, they were there for his sentencing. And it was interesting, which is in the book, and I won't try to tell you every word of the book, which is in the book about their observations when they were finally
Mhm.
face to face with this man.
Okay. So do you have a law degree or is it your husband?
I went to law school, but About 2/3 of the way through, I realized I didn't want to be a lawyer. It was all about arguing with everybody, and I'm not very confrontational, and I want everybody to like me, and that's not the way it is in the world of law. So
No.
that is not the way it is. And we were married before either one of us went to law school, but Jim had already graduated and was practicing law. And once he started practicing law, I knew, okay, it's so confrontational. It's people are always mad at you. And he had to work so much that I'd had 2 children by that time. Both of them were born when I was in law school. And I would never have time to be a mother if I really was trying to
Yep.
be a lawyer. So
Mhm.
there were a lot of reasons for it. And by then I was writing, and I really did know all along that was pretty much what I wanted to do, but I felt like it wasn't very practical. And I was trying to be practical.
So how does, obviously having someone in that arena has got to help. Could you explain how his law degree or him being a lawyer practicing, how does that help you write true crime?
It's a ready resource right at my fingertips anytime. And when we were doing the first book, when Brian and I, my son and I, were doing the first book, there was a lot of legalese in the court documents. And so he was very helpful for that. And there's just something that'll come up ever so often, and you'll go, well, I don't understand. This seems very weird to me about why they would handle it this way. And he can give an insight into that, into what that is. And it helps it all become a little bit clearer.
That's cool.
That's very
imagine.
convenient, Vicki.
Yeah.
I need
And
to find myself
Nice to
a
have that
lawyer.
resource.
Yeah, it is really interesting because criminal law, I made my very highest grade that I made in law school in criminal law and won an award for it. But
Nice.
I only remember like this much of it. So I
That's so
remember burglary and robbery are very specific, and people use them interchangeably all the time. But
Yeah.
don't ask me right here. I'll have to think too long to figure to tell you.
That's so funny. Okay, you touched on it a little. So if someone wants to start writing true crime, where would you recommend they start learning and that whole process?
First of all, of course, if you have access to somebody who's done it before, or if you have access to a class, like I said, that just turned on the light for me to take that class. That's a wonderful thing. Read as much as you can read. Now there's all the podcasts. There are pages and pages of true crime podcasts. And when I say find somebody that knows about it, for example, Kate Winkler Dawson, who I was talking about, she comes to St. Louis every time she writes a book to promote it. She's from Texas, but she comes to St. Louis, and she is so open to people asking her questions and things like that. There's a resource for you to go to those kinds of things if you have access to that. There were 2 things that I think I really learned along the way that help with getting started. Like you said, Nicki, you have access to a personal kind of experience that involves true crime, and that, as I did too. I think having that connection to something that I would not have that same connection to your subject as you have. Having that connection to something is really important, because one time I pitched a true crime book to an editor, and what he said to me, and I think it would have been interesting, but I understand why he gave me this answer. He said, unless you can tell me or write about something that isn't already out there in the media, in the newspapers, in whatever, then it's a no-go. You need that little extra something that you can give it. I think that's one of the reasons that there's that tendency for people to integrate themselves into the story, because that's something that isn't something that anybody else would have, was the personal
Right.
your personal experience with solving the crime or being involved in the investigation or whatever. And I think the story also has an angle. That's one of the things that Ellen Harris talked about was, okay, there had been these 2 child abductions and murders, actually, Cassidy Center and Abby. I forget what her last name was.
Hoffman.
Was it? Okay,
I
I
think
don't
so.
remember.
Abby Hoffman.
And anyways, for example, she had written an article about Cassidy Center because Cassidy had one of those alarms that she wore to, if something was going to go wrong. She would come home after school and her mother was still at work, and she wore an alarm that you could push a button and it would make a noise, hopefully to get someone's attention to interfere with whatever was going to happen. She wrote an article about that because she had the alarm on. The alarm went off, and her perpetrator actually buried it in the yard to keep anybody from hearing it. And it was like, so do these really work? What could be better, kind of thing about it? That kind of thing. An angle, a new perspective, something like that, I think is really important when you're writing true crime. I'm thinking of 2 things where the author injected themselves. I can think of more than that. But the Golden State Killer one, I'll Be Gone in the Dark, it was about Michelle's search for the Golden State Killer. So everything she did along the way, as well as everything about the Golden State Killer and how they finally tracked him down. A cohort of hers, Paul Holes, wrote a book about the same thing. And his was very autobiographical about his whole career, and then came to a climax with the Golden State Killer thing. There's one about a killing at Harvard, and I'm sorry, I've totally forgotten the name of it. And the person lived in the apartment building, and it had become a cold case, and how the things that they found that brought that case back to life and being right there at the time. So I don't know that you have to be that involved. And as I said, I don't know about if you're actually part of the solution, part of the case, if that's the right way to go, but something. There needs to be something that nobody else can write.
Yeah, that seems like that for all sorts of nonfiction stories, that you're giving a different angle on it or pouring something into it that nobody else can put into it. So that makes a lot of sense. So sounds like you've had fun with the true crime. Are you going to try any more? Write any more true crime books?
I don't have any. Like I said, I had this one idea that I would really like to pursue. It's one of the cases I wrote about in the Notorious Crimes. There's a character in the case whose name is Ira Cooper. He was the first African-American full-time police officer on the St. Louis Police Force. Before him, they would just hire per diem African-American police officer to come in. He solved so many cases. Oh my gosh, if you put his name in during the years that he was a police officer, you will get so many things about him. I have another friend who was also researching him. He was born in Mexico, Missouri, which is where I'm from.
Your hometown. Yeah,
my hometown. And he was a player in the Margaret Mortimer murder, which is one of the notorious crimes that I wrote about in the Bicentennial book. They brought him in to investigate that case because he had his finger on the pulse of the African American community in Mexico. And quite honestly, it was looking at the social mores of the time. They were only looking for African Americans to have committed this crime. So they brought him in. Okay, he did not keep notes. He went home. He says, I have a lead. He went back to St. Louis and to pursue the lead and to do his job in St. Louis. And he had a massive heart attack and died. And so
it's like, what did he know?
I know. What did he know? Jane, this friend that I went to high school with, was also looking into it. People in Mexico have this, I'm going to say, morbid fascination with that Margaret Mortimer case because it's never been solved. And it was seemingly so random. And it had this chain of murder that kind of went along with it, that it's just a fascinating case. I have tried and am trying to incorporate it into fiction. I first tried to write the story as fiction, and that didn't work for me. I tried to write it in a second book, that wasn't working. And so now I'm working on a third mystery that incorporates that with the sleuth trying to solve a present day murder that's tied to that murder. So anyways,
That's
but anyways, because I too am fascinated on it. There's another woman from Mexico who I don't know because I think she's younger than me. I think she's like the age of my children, who's written a book that is very loosely based. It's more the setting than it is the actual people involved in the case. We're all fascinated with it. I met this teacher. She taught 6th grade for many years, and every year she had her kids do their own investigation.
Oh, wow.
wow.
Yeah, and I said,
I bet
"Oh
they
my
love
gosh,
that."
I know." She said she had some that were more into it than others, and she had some that were just like so determined that they were going to figure out what had happened. And nobody has, and she had something that's not even in the book that she told me when we met in Mexico at a later date, that isn't even in the book, that kind of makes you rethink one of the people that they said, no, there's no way that person could do it. But this was a really prominent person, and they didn't even investigate any prominent people that were close around her. So it's, well.
And maybe do you think maybe the reason why certain cases we get hooked on, because they're the ones that are so normal everyday life, walking home from a store, you know what I mean? And we get fixed because
Eve.
Yes, because the other ones, it's like, I would never do that. So that would never happen to me. But I walk home from the store. So now what? Like, we have to find the perp because...
She'd been to the newsstand and had an armful of magazines.
Spoons. And,
the 6 silver spoons. I've also written about the 6 silver spoons, because if they ever found the 6 silver spoons, they would have a major clue to this whole mystery.
It needs to be the name of the book, 6 Silver Spoons.
There you go.
Oh man, the 6 silver spoons just,
you need to
do it. Have me fascinated. And now I totally forgot what I was saying.
I'm sorry.
You answered it. You answered it. We were talking about whether you're going to do another crime book or not.
Yeah, I don't know. I may incorporate things from my research into crime books, but I don't know, because like I said, I have this reservation now. I really feel, I'm not sure. I'm just, I don't want to aggrandize crime. I don't want to intrude on victims and their families. And so I just don't know. One of the other crimes in the notorious Missouri is the Kirkwood City Hall massacre. And it was at a time when I was living in Kirkwood. Jim was out walking the dog, and there was this little store down in the corner, and the woman ran out to Jim and said, "Oh, you need to get home and lock your doors, because there's this terrible crime, and I don't know if they have the person that did it or not, but go home." Jim comes practically running in that. But writing that up was very emotional for me, because I knew the people involved. I knew the police officer had been a school resource officer, and every day he would stop and pet our dog, and actually he'd also make sure she had tags. Mostly he would pet her. It was one of the fathers of one of my son's schoolmates that was one of his really good friends that was at our house all the time. He was one of the victims. And I knew the mayor at the time was a good friend of ours. And anyways, I could not write that. I must have cried a gallon of tears while I was trying to write that, because it was just, it just took me there. And I thought, oh my gosh, if Art McDonald reads this, or if Kathy's, the mother, if she reads this, you know what, that would affect them even worse than it was affecting me. I was this far away and they were this close. So
it's also a way, and especially the way you did it, to honor them
and
their
lives.
Try. And you did. I don't know those people, but I feel like I understood what they were to you and the community. And there's also that side of it.
Those police officers, those are the epitome of what really good heroic police work is an example of. Anyways, so that one was really hard for me, very hard for me. And the kidnapping that was here with Sean and Michael Devlin. And I had one of my friends' husband works for the Kirkwood Police Department. In fact, he was the juvenile officer for the Kirkwood Police Department. And so I had access to him for that and for the City Hall massacre. So just like I said, it's just finding those people.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be a main player.
Right.
Even people on the periphery could tell you things that you wouldn't know otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
But Jane, anyways, tried to get in touch with Ira Cooper's family. And I think she did get in touch with his son, who was a dean at Howard University. But they didn't know anything either. They didn't have
Okay.
any access to anything. St. Louis
Yeah.
used to have a police library. And their librarian got sick. And it's all closed down now. And I don't know what they're going to do with their stuff. But I hope they don't just...
No, I
ditch
hope
it.
not.
No.
But
Treasure.
I mean, again, that would be an excellent place to go for
Yeah.
research on something that's happened in St. Louis in the past.
Yeah.
When you were asking that question earlier, Stephanie, I totally
So
forgot
interesting.
about that.
Yeah. All those nuggets. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks, Vicki.
And I go to sometimes local historical societies will have something. Or if they don't have something, the person that's in charge will tell you stuff.
Maybe know or know someone. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Like somebody gave me an email that they had written to a niece or somebody of a victim, and the victim and she had written back her version of what had happened. And so it's those little pieces.
So it's really being a detective yourself too.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Not in the intrusive, I'm going to solve
Right.
this kind of way. Although if you
Yeah.
came up with a solution, I know that would be a very satisfying feeling.
Yes, it would.
Sure.
Yeah.
The Mortimer murder happened in 1937, so it's nobody is around anymore that would have a connection to that. But I know we would still love to know.
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. True crime is only one aspect of all the things you write. So with all of your experience in the different aspects of publishing, do you have any specific advice that you would give to writers out there?
At this point, I know I've had books published and I've worked in the business. I still don't feel like I handled my career properly. And so I would say from the start, and I know this is something that you guys are dedicated to and want to help people with, I would say have a plan or have what you want to do next. I didn't even know anything. I didn't know it wasn't okay. At that point, it's okay now. But at that point, when I was submitting initially, I didn't know it wasn't okay to send the same thing to every publisher that was listed in the writer's guide. I didn't know that because at that point, that was a huge big no. Simultaneous submissions were verboten. You did one submission at a time. And it didn't take quite as long as it takes now, but it took a long time. My first book, it took 9 months for them to send me a letter that said, we're interested in your manuscript. And then it was another 4 months before they called me and said, we want to buy your manuscript. So it was that long. And at that point, I didn't know what was going to happen. I guess I thought, it was a long time ago, so I don't know exactly what my thoughts were. But I think I thought, if this doesn't go, then I'm not any good and it's not going to happen for me, because I did not sit down and start writing something else, which is exactly what I should have done. I had ideas, and I didn't have anybody that was telling me. I didn't even know any other writers.
Mm-hmm.
The only writer I knew, by then I had met Pat McKissick, and she was the one that encouraged me to send something in. But it was after that book was published before I met any other writers. So I think you, number one, need to have support of people that know what's going on out there in the world. Don't be too shy about asking. Once I joined SCBWI, that was a good thing. It was SCBW then, but it is SCBWI now. And I made friends, and they were my support group, and they were my writers group. At a conference, I met some other authors from St. Louis that were writing children's books at that time. That's all I was writing. And we had a little group that went on for years and years. That to me is probably one of the key elements. you could start even further back, do your reading, do your research, know what's
Sure.
going on. But it's those people that are in your life that are interested in what you're doing that make the big difference.
Build
And
community, keep writing. What
keep
else?
writing.
And know your path, she said.
Yeah,
Yeah.
know your path.
And I
Mhm.
was write consistently. It's not supposed to be easy, but we've all met these people.
Say that again. Say that again.
Yes. Yes.
It's not supposed to be easy. We've
There we
all
go.
met those people who said, I have this idea that I'm going to write. And
Mhm.
you just want to tell them, it takes so much time. And
Yeah.
But anyways, even though it isn't easy and it takes time, make time. Because if you don't make time, it's not going to get done.
Mm.
My son used to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning so he would have time to write. And before he went to work. And that was what he did.
Yeah.
I think now that his kids are the age they are, and I remember when my kids were that age too, it's harder to do everything that he would like to do. And he's published some short stories and he's published a novelette in a anthology. He's working. He doesn't give up, and that's the other thing. Don't give up.
Yeah. Which
I
is
mean,
so hard.
how many people do we all know that give up after, even though they're good? It doesn't mean that you're not good.
Right. And there's different seasons. Like we all go through different seasons, whether it's our children are a certain age or there's an illness in the family or whatever it is. And that's okay.
And publishing does
and
the same
publishing
thing.
does. Yes.
And I think
they take a break too, the audacity.
And they need you as a writer. And I am not saying write to the market here. What I'm saying is you need to know, though, what's going on in the market and what is being published. And one of the reasons I say that, one of the reasons that I changed from writing children's books to writing adult stuff is that the kind of children's books that there are today, for the most part, are not the kinds of things that I write and not the kinds of things that I want to write. I'm not an issues person. And issues, that was one of the things when I first started writing, was you would write about an issue, a character with an issue. And there's just so many things. You guys, if you're listening to this, you probably know how publishing goes around and around.
Evolves
and
changes.
Yeah. Consistently. And that's a matter, I think, of time management. You have to take time management. And whoever introduced me, Stephanie introduced me, said, I have an MFA. You do not need an MFA. I got an MFA mainly because it was the pandemic and because I was making this big
you love
change.
school.
And I love school. And I was making this change from children's to adult writing. And I had written, I think, at least 2 adult mysteries, and they just weren't working, and I knew they weren't working, and nobody could tell me why they weren't working. My mentor told me after my very first submission my main things that I was doing wrong. And from then on, I felt like I knew what I was doing. Now, that book has not been published, but I wrote a whole book, and it's there. But mainly, I would say, write and get a writing group and decide what you want your career to be.
Thank you so much, Vicki.
No.
You are always a wealth of information.
Yes.
If you haven't read any of Vicki's books, go get them, especially the true crime. She is brilliant, and we appreciate you being here, Vicki. Thank you for joining us on Wayward Writers. Conquer Your Path.